Tier lists suck. Here's why. If you played Honkai Star Rail for any number of time, any reasonable amount of time through multiple banners, you've noticed that pretty much any time a tier list update occurs, it essentially just puts the newest unit in the S+ tier slot. Now, this isn't singling out this specific tier list. It happens with pretty much all tier lists, and this isn't incorrect. The newest unit is usually the best. Jingliu is amazing, and Babalunai is amazing, and so on and so forth. The problem is, they don't really mean anything. Now, the information the tier list gives you, and the information on sites like Pridwin is actually pretty good. The calculations are nice, the review is nice, and the build and team comp section is nice. But for the vast majority of the player base, a tier list usually only works when you're getting into the game either A, for the first time, or B, when you've been away for a long period of time. Because most of you likely know that the newer characters are going to be better in some way, shape, or form, or as you learn more about the game, and as you get more experience with the characters, with the units you have, with the units that you eventually do get, and that eventually do release, you gain a better understanding of who's good for what, and how you end up playing. Tier lists that update consistently, whether it's every time a new banner rolls around, or every time a new patch ends, don't necessarily provide you with any long-term value because the newer units are stronger, and if it's a DPS unit, that's essentially all that matters. How strong the DPS is, and how flexible or viable they are for free-to-play characters or for free-to-play players. With that being said, supports as a whole are just usually worthwhile to build unless they offer an extremely niche amount of support. And so, tier lists that update consistently lose value the longer you play and the more you have. Jingliu being S+ tier means very little to all of you who either A, already have her, or B, already have a good DPS. Same thing with Babalunai. If you have Sealy, if you have Blade, if you have Jing Yuan, if you have Kafka, these new characters being S+ tier doesn't mean much to you because you already have a good DPS. And so a tier list only gives you the big picture if you don't have any characters and are looking toward or at the opportunity to where you can grab one. If you have multiple units, if you have Sealy, let's say you hypothetically have Sealy and Jing Yuan, that tier list doesn't necessarily equate to how valuable a character would be given your current roster. It can tell you how good they are in AoE, it can tell you how good they are in single target scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily give you any insight into what value this unit would otherwise bring to your account. And so tier lists don't necessarily provide you with individualized support, which is perfectly understandable. They can't do that for every player. But the concept of a tier list holding weight doesn't really mean much when, for all intents and purposes, the tier list as a whole only means something to people who are not playing the game or do not have a lot to begin with. If you have one DPS, let's say it's Sealy, and you've skipped out on everyone else, and you're wondering who is still worthwhile to use, then yes, that tier list is valuable because you do have options. But if you do have DPSs, if you pull for any character or every character, if you are in a position to where you can clear content easily, that tier list means nothing because you are already either at the end game point or know what you want. And that only concerns it if you're looking at the meta perspective. And looking at things from that perspective only works if the meta does not change. If you're looking for an example, Genshin Impact, another HoYoverse game, shifted from the melt and the vape meta that we previously had all the way over into a dendro reaction oriented meta. If you are an individual who used melt and vape, you are having a more difficult time clearing content because most of the content that's currently available is shifting towards the newer element. Now, this isn't the same thing that's going to happen to HSR, at least not that we know of, but it's still important to consider. If your tier list only considers who is the strongest unit as of right now, who is the easiest to build, or whatever the case may be, and who has the highest damage ceiling, it doesn't mean much when the next unit that comes out is essentially guaranteed to be stronger than them. We've been at a point in HSR to where Blade was strong, and then we knew Babalunai was going to be stronger, and then we know Jingliu was going to be stronger, and we know that progressively power creep, as much people don't like to admit it, is a big issue. There isn't a situation right now in this game to where I can legitimately look at someone or any of the number of characters we have and say, yeah, they are all interchangeable for one another because they are all on equal power levels. No, that's not it. Destruction as a whole is a far better path for any character to be in because it gets so many stats. Jingliu, 50% crit rate, a bunch of crit damage in her kit, speed as a stat she can get in minor traces, attack, and has AoE and less skill point consumption than other units. We have individuals like Babalunai who gives himself damage percent, ult damage percent, crit damage, further crit damage if the enemy's weak to imaginary. Blade, his relic set gives him crit rates. He gets HP and he scales off HP. Compared to characters like Sealy, which I mentioned previously, and other units, there is a distinct difference, not necessarily just in what a character can do, but in the amount of investment required. If you are starting out right now, and let's say you have 100 Trailblaze fuels, you are more easily capable of building up a Jingliu, a Blade, and an Embodied Lunai than a Sealy, Jingyuan, and Kafka. And that is an issue, because even if we're talking about the theoretical 1 to 2% or maybe 5% difference between an Embodied Lunai and a Jingliu, that is something that is much more further emphasized when you compare a Jingliu and Embodied Lunai to a Sealy and Jingyuan. Because if you pulled for those two characters, there is a distinct difference in not only what they can do, but what they have available to them in terms of potential supports. Jingliu is in a far better position than your Jingyuan. In terms of single target scenarios, Topaz as a hunt character is going to be better than your Sealy, more than likely. And that represents a problem, because power creep isn't just who deals more damage, it is who's easier to build, who's easier to get going, who requires less investment, who has more potential or a higher potential to reach their damage ceiling, and that's important. So I don't think a tier list matters much when the characters themselves are consistently getting so much stronger that it's almost unrealistic to thereby then say that the patch 1.0 characters are still as viable as these 1.4 units. Because they are not. Sealy and Jingyuan are not as good as these newer units we released. Standard banner units have dropped so significantly in their viability that it's unreasonable. If you invested in a DPS like Yanqing, like Himiko, then that character as a whole both of them have lost so much value by comparison to, even if we're looking at Genshin, you had Diluc still being used when Hu Tao released. Hu Tao was stronger, but Diluc was still really good. Now Diluc is worthless. At least back then, there was much more competition for at least the first full year. We're not even a year, we're barely half a year into this game's lifespan, and it's already this bad. At this point, I'm just gonna make every video into a discussion video. I wanna know your thoughts. Do you think tier lists matter, and do you think power creep is getting unreasonable in this game? Because I'm an individual who has a lot of units, and I think it's pretty bad. But I understand that's just my opinion. Tell me yours. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.